The rain had already stopped, but the windshield was still covered with tiny drops that caught the glow of every streetlight. I thought I was simply driving my best friend's mother home after one of the hardest days of her life. I believed silence would fill the ride, just as grief had filled the funeral. But just as I turned onto the street leading to her house, she quietly looked out the window and whispered something that completely changed the night, and eventually changed my life. She softly asked me to take one more loop around the neighborhood before going home. At that moment I didn't understand why such a simple request carried so much weight, but by the end of that drive I realized I wasn't just driving a grieving mother through familiar streets. I was helping someone hold on to the last pieces of a life she wasn't ready to let go of. Before we continue, if you believe kindness still exists, if you believe small acts can heal broken hearts, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Your support helps stories like this reach people who may need them the most. My best friend Ethan and I had been inseparable since childhood. We learned to ride bicycles together, survived high school together, and dreamed about the futures we wanted. His parents treated me like another son. His mother, Linda, never let me leave their house without eating something, even when I insisted I wasn't hungry. She celebrated my birthdays, attended my graduation, and reminded me every year that family wasn't always defined by blood. When Ethan moved across the country for work, I stayed behind. I promised him I would check on his parents whenever I could, and it became part of my routine without ever feeling like an obligation. Life, however, has a cruel way of changing routines without asking permission. Ethan's father suffered a sudden heart attack only a few weeks after celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. The loss shook everyone who knew him. The funeral brought together relatives, neighbors, old co-workers, and friends who shared stories about his kindness, his laugh, and the quiet way he solved problems without asking for recognition. Throughout the ceremony, Linda barely cried. She simply smiled politely, thanked everyone for coming, and held herself together with a strength that looked almost impossible. Yet anyone paying close attention could see that her eyes had become distant, as though a part of her had already disappeared with her husband. After the funeral everyone slowly returned to their own lives, but grief doesn't leave when the guests do. As people hugged goodbye and drove away, Linda was left standing alone beside the empty driveway. Ethan couldn't return immediately because of work overseas, and he called me with a heavy voice, asking me to stay close to his mother until he could come home. I promised him I would. The drive home began in complete silence. The radio stayed off, and only the sound of tires rolling over wet pavement filled the car. We passed familiar stores, parks, and intersections that had probably looked exactly the same for decades. Then, just before reaching her street, she quietly asked me to keep driving. She wanted one more loop around the neighborhood. I nodded without asking questions because something in her expression told me she wasn't looking for conversation. She was searching for something far more difficult. We drove past the little bakery where her husband used to buy fresh bread every Saturday morning. She smiled faintly while looking through the window, remembering how he always brought home cinnamon rolls before anyone else was awake. We passed the old playground where Ethan had learned to swing. She pointed toward an empty bench where she and her husband spent countless evenings watching their son chase other children across the grass. Every corner held another memory. Every stop sign seemed connected to another chapter of their life together. I realized she wasn't delaying going home because she feared being alone. She was saying goodbye to a lifetime that existed in ordinary places most people never noticed. As we continued circling the neighborhood, she began sharing stories I had never heard before. She talked about meeting her husband at a tiny grocery store when they accidentally reached for the same can of soup. She remembered struggling through difficult years when money was scarce but laughter somehow remained abundant. She recalled arguments that felt enormous at the time but seemed meaningless now compared to losing him forever. Listening to her, I understood that the strongest marriages weren't built from perfect moments. They were built from thousands of imperfect days survived together with patience, forgiveness, and love. The sky gradually darkened, and the streets became almost empty. Instead of feeling sad, I began feeling honored. Out of everyone she could have chosen, she trusted me to witness these final laps through the life she had built. She wasn't asking for more time with her husband because she knew that was impossible. She simply wanted a little more time before opening the front door and facing the unbearable silence waiting inside. Eventually we parked outside her house. She looked at the porch light glowing softly in the darkness but didn't move. The home looked exactly the same as it had every other evening, yet now it felt completely different. She admitted that walking inside meant accepting that only one pair of shoes would be waiting by the door instead of two. Only one toothbrush would remain beside the sink. Only one voice would answer when she spoke aloud. That realization frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Instead of leaving immediately, I asked if she would mind if I came inside for a while. We made tea in the quiet kitchen, and together we looked through old photo albums spread across the dining table. There were faded pictures of vacations, birthdays, camping trips, school plays, and ordinary Sundays that nobody had expected to become priceless memories. As each photograph appeared, another story followed. Sometimes she laughed until tears formed. Sometimes the tears came first. Yet little by little, the fear inside that house seemed to soften. Over the following weeks I visited often. Sometimes I mowed the lawn. Sometimes I fixed small things around the house that her husband would normally have repaired. Other evenings we simply sat on the porch watching the sunset without saying much at all. Grief didn't disappear, but it slowly became less lonely. Ethan finally returned home months later, and he found his mother smiling more often than crying. She still missed her husband every single day, but she had begun living again instead of merely surviving. One afternoon she thanked me for taking that extra drive instead of insisting on going straight home. She explained that those few circles around the neighborhood gave her enough courage to face a future she never wanted. She said kindness isn't measured by grand gestures but by the willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier. Her words stayed with me long after that conversation ended, and they continue guiding the way I treat people whose pain isn't always visible. If this story touched your heart, please support Kindness Corner by liking this video, sharing it with someone you love, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. Every interaction helps meaningful stories reach more hearts around the world. Before this story ends, please tell us in the comments, what is one memory of someone you love that you never want to forget? Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person isn't advice, money, or even answers. Sometimes it's simply one more loop around the neighborhood. One more conversation. One more cup of tea. One more quiet moment that reminds someone they don't have to carry their grief alone. Years later, whenever I drive through that neighborhood, I still slow down near the bakery, the playground, and the familiar streets where an ordinary car ride became an unforgettable lesson about love, loss, and compassion. I learned that healing rarely arrives in dramatic moments. It comes quietly, one small act of kindness at a time, proving that while we cannot change the past or stop heartbreak from finding us, we can always choose to walk beside someone until they find the strength to keep moving forward.